Thank you everybody for joining us today for this webinar about vaccinations and your employees and some of the issues and options you should be thinking about. We have Katharine Batista with Offit Kurman joining us. She's going to be going through addressing mandatory vaccination, some of the things and issues you should be talking about, incentive plans, and how you could be approaching this with your employees to get them going through the vaccination process. If you have questions, you can put them into the chat, but if you also wanted to you could unmute yourself and ask the question during the presentation. Katharine is definitely open to that, especially if it relates to the topic at the time while she's speaking about it. But at the end, if you have questions, please put them in our chat and we could have some open dialogue after the whole presentation's done. And with that, Katharine, I am going to turn this over to you. And thank you so much again for joining us today and for doing this presentation for us.
Thanks so much, Hope, and thanks for hosting me. I'm happy to present to all of you. Again, my name is Katharine Batista. I'm an employment and labor attorney at Offit Kurman. We are a full-service firm with locations. We have 13 offices now. I'm located in our Center City, Philadelphia office. And I'm going to talk to you today about vaccines for your employees and kind of the myriad of legal implications that can go along with that. So just to sort of give you an overview of what I want to touch on, certainly, for those of you who are considering and wondering, can I mandate my employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine? We'll go through that. Similarly, screening questions, what you can ask about the vaccine, if you're partnering with someone else to actually administer the vaccine, those questions and where they fall in terms of potentially implicating some type of legal liability. Alternatively, if you decide to do vaccine incentives as opposed to mandates, I'll cover what you can do there. Discrimination concerns that you should be aware of. Also proof of vaccines. Whether or not you're able to do that and how. Sick leave is always an incredibly complicated patchwork of federal and state and local laws. So I'll sort of explain how that plays into this particular issue. Wage and hour issues that could potentially come up, with respect to how you're compensating employees who go to get their vaccine or having a reaction to the vaccine. And then finally, I'll touch on workers' comp issues. And I always like to wrap up sort of giving an idea of this obviously is not, I'm here to tell you about the legal implications and potential liability. And from a legal standpoint, what you can and can't do. But this is obviously a more complicated issue, of course, than just from a legal standpoint. So I like to give sort of best practices and even just some suggestions that I've seen that I have clients who are implementing because how to tackle this, especially right now, there are a lot of solutions and you have to do what's right for your business. So I just want to give us sort of an overview of where we are with the vaccine. I know we probably all feel a little bit inundated with COVID-19 information in general, and then sort of the state of vaccines. But just to give us a perspective, technically 3 vaccines have FDA authorization, obviously in the US. I'm sure all of you listening have heard that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been temporarily paused. That notwithstanding, as of this week, I believe all states have announced that all adult Americans 16 and over are eligible to receive the vaccine, meaning essentially your entire workforce now has access to the vaccine. So that sort of changes the landscape. Before, when employers were considering what they might do, it was kind of a down the road when the vaccine is actually available. Now it's here. Everyone has the opportunity to get it. That's not to say there aren't still, scheduling issues and whatnot with distribution, but technically all your employees are eligible to get it now. The most recent statistic I saw was that 132.3 million Americans had received at least 1 dose. The administration was approximately 3.13 million per day, meaning that about a quarter of Americans have been fully vaccinated now. we've all heard a lot about herd immunity and what that means and what we need to reach it. I think it's sort of been a source of somewhat confusion, and there's a lot of information surrounding it. The CDC is now saying we essentially have to reach 70 to 90% of the US population having some type of resistance, either because they've already had it or because they're vaccinated to have herd immunity. So given those statistics, it looks like we're on our way. The CDC has come out in numerous instances and basically asked and encouraged employers to advocate for the vaccine and to help get their employees vaccinated as a way to sort of up those percentages and those numbers to reach herd immunity. A recent statistics I saw that was focused on the restaurant community and what restaurants are doing around the vaccine. Now, I will say this is changing every single day. And this study was from about 3 weeks ago. And I would imagine it's changed even since then, because now the vaccine is fully accessible. But at that time, approximately of those polled, 50% of restaurant employers plan to incentivize the vaccine, which again, I will go over. 40% planned to, or 39% plan to encourage it, but not necessarily with a structured incentive. 5% said they weren't going to incentivize, and 6 didn't have a plan yet. 6% didn't have a plan yet. Probably because at the time they didn't need one yet. So let's kind of go through your options here. If you decide that what you'd like to do is mandate the vaccine, legally speaking, you can do that. What the EOC has advised is that legally you can do it. There are some caveats to how you do it. So the first one we've hit, right? You can't, this is just sort of intuitive. You can't mandate the vaccine if everyone can't get the vaccine. So now that everyone is actually eligible to receive it, it is generally available to the American public. So that threshold has been met. Beyond that, if you want to do a mandate, you have to make sure that you have some exceptions. So you want to make sure that you allow employees who have some type of underlying medical condition or who have a sincerely held religious belief to be able to obtain an exemption from having to get the vaccine. Those are the two recognized statuses where your employee under the law has to, you at least have to consider the potential accommodations that you give them. And then the final issue is you have to make sure that the policy doesn't conflict with a collective bargaining agreement that's currently in force. So if you do have any portion of your workforce that is unionized, that'll come into play. Obviously, if you don't have any CBAs, and that's not a worry for you. There is one, I'll say, small opposing legal theory that's recently been advanced as to a vaccine mandate. I will say the case where this legal theory was advanced was against an employer that was a municipality, right? So as a private employer, I would say my recommendation would be this isn't going to apply to you. This is not something you have to worry about. I just want to bring it up so that you understand it's out there. Technically, the United States code that governs the distribution and administration of a vaccine that only has emergency use authorization, which is what the vaccines have now. They don't have full authorization from the FDA, it's emergency use authorization. So technically, when that is the mechanism under which a vaccine is being distributed, usually the guidance under the United States Code is that people have the option to refuse or accept the administration. So there was recently a case filed where the argument is it was actually a police force that was trying to mandate the vaccine. So again, there's state involvement there. And the argument was, under United States Code, because this hasn't been fully authorized yet, we shouldn't, I shouldn't be required to get this as a mandate. Again, this hasn't received much traction. We've not heard anything else about this. And my speculation is I don't think that this will hold weight generally, and certainly as a private employer, it's not something you need to worry about because you're not an actor of the state. Just something I wanted to point out. Generally speaking, though, the legal recommendation is you can mandate the vaccine. Those are just the considerations. So if you're going to mandate it, we could go to the next slide, please. If you're going to mandate it and you want to understand what that policy needs to look like. So what do you have to allow your employees in terms of a potential exemption? So the framework that lets you do a mandate is basically you have made the determination as an employer that if someone comes back to work and they're not vaccinated, that person would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of the other employees as well as your customers. Particularly as a restaurant, that is going to be something you're easily able to satisfy, right? You know, if we're talking about a business that has, never has clients that are actually on site and has a way to sort of isolate all of their employees, it might be harder to reach that threshold. Here, certainly a restaurant is going to be able to, right? You are customer contact, employee interaction, those are integral to your operations. So certainly you can meet that. That being said, so that means, okay, under applicable federal law, you're able to do the mandate. So if an employee comes to you, and I always would recommend, if you're going to do a vaccine mandate, you want a written policy. If you're going to do an incentive, you want a written policy. I would say you should have a COVID policy in general right now. It's going to sort of be a liquid document, and that, you know, as information changes and things changes, obviously now, hopefully we are nearing the end of this beast. And you're bringing people back and you're starting to resume operations. Hopefully we're getting toward that full operations status again. But you want a written policy, both for communication to your employees, but also for your own protection, right? So it's really clear what your stance on COVID-19 safety, sick leave related to it, and then of course, you know, however you're treating the vaccine. So you're going to make an exemption for employees that have some type of, the best way to look at it, even though this comes from the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the best way to look at it is really an underlying medical condition. So the obvious ones we think of are physical conditions, right? If someone, you know, you do your mandated vaccine policy and you have an employee come to you and say, I can't get it because I have some underlying health condition that results in my having a severe anaphylactic reaction to vaccines, right? That could be fatal. So I cannot get this vaccine. That's kind of an obvious one. If you heard that, right, you're going to know, okay, this is protected. We have to work with this employee. Some that might be less intuitive, you know, mental disabilities are equally protected under the ADA. So this is a harder one to navigate, but if you have an employee who comes to you and says, I have a severe anxiety disorder, and particularly around COVID-19 or the vaccine specifically, or vaccines in general, right? My anxiety is so heightened. I take medication for it, I'm treated for it, but it's so heightened and I'm so scared of getting the vaccine. It's a real trigger for this underlying mental health condition. That's something that could very well also be protected under the ADA. What's going to be hard as an employer is differentiating between your employees who just say, I'm nervous because it's new, versus having an actual mental disability that would qualify them for protection. Which is why you just want to make sure that these requests are, one, going to the same person in your organization, your business, so you can make sure you have consistent decision making. And that person is well trained on what to consider, you know, when they see red flags, okay, this person is someone who might be protected, what do I need to do next? And then the final category is pregnancy. Pregnancy is always sort of a source of confusion under the law because it's not treated as a disability, but it is protected in that you have to treat pregnant employees the same as you would non-pregnant employees. this creates a little bit of a complication if you have a pregnant employee who comes to you and says that they want an exemption because of their pregnancy. It's really a gray area. The CDC guidance has changed. I don't want to say a full 180, but it's changed pretty significantly because there's no real data on the vaccine and its effects on pregnant women, and their unborn children, what that could do down the road. It's really a lack of data. The guidance now from the CDC and most major ACOG and other major medical organizations affiliated with pregnancy and OBGYN are now advocating for it and saying that pregnant women not only can get the vaccine, but now because they're at higher risk for a more severe case of COVID should get it. That's not to say you're not going to have pregnant employees who still feel really nervous because they are pregnant to get the vaccine. That's one I would take on a case-by-case basis. There could be also another medical condition that goes along with their pregnancy that you have to consider. But that should be another one that gives you a red flag. That person might be entitled to protection, might be entitled to an exemption. If that is the case, you have this employee, what do? Right? So what are your obligations in terms of giving them some type of reasonable accommodation? First, you have to consider, and this is one that's especially for the restaurant industry, you're going to kind of fly through this two-tiered process because it's going to be very rare that you have a position where someone can work totally remotely. If you are getting into if you're a larger organization, you're getting into corporate positions, perhaps. But basically the first phase of it is, okay, is there any way I can accommodate this person at work so that they can continue to work without the vaccine and it doesn't, it still meets the threshold where they're not a direct threat to anybody? Does that mean additional PPE, working in a way where they're isolated? Again, this is going to be really hard for your industry to find those accommodations. Not that they aren't required to be considered, but depending on what that person's position is, it might be really hard to find an accommodation for them. The main thing you want to make sure you're doing is going through the process, right? To show that you exhausted these potential ways that you could have accommodated the person, allowed them to still work. Typically, if you can't find a way to accommodate them that allows them to still be at the workplace, the next step would be, okay, can we give this person a teleworking option? And then you consider within that teleworking option, can they continue to work without the vaccine? If you go through that whole process and you ultimately find there's no way to accommodate them and let them continue to do, the goal is always to find an accommodation that enables them to work. So if you find that there's no accommodation that does that, then you can move to terminate. But you want to be, this is an area you want to be really careful in because employees are going to be really attuned to it. It's a new area of law, but you want to make sure you're carefully well documenting that process. The other thing you should be aware of is that under the law, leave is considered a potential reasonable accommodation. That doesn't mean you have to allow this person to go on leave until the pandemic's over, right? Leave is a potential accommodation to the extent it would help someone get back to work. Let's say in the case of a pregnant employee who is due in a few weeks, if you give them leave early and then they were going to take a maternity leave anyways, and by the time they can come back to work, they can get vaccinated because they will no longer be pregnant. That's something where it could be feasible. Just keep in mind that the ADA and the EEOC does say that you have to consider leave as a potential accommodation to the extent that short-term leave would allow that person to eventually get back to work. We can go to the next slide. So the other protected status is if someone has a sincerely held religious belief. So if you have an employee who comes to you and says, my religion prevents me from obtaining the vaccine and I want an exemption for it. Unlike with a disability or underlying medical condition, and I should note, same with the way you could always request medical certification you can ask that employee, this is going back to the medical exemption now, you can ask that employee for some type of medical documentation that shows, one, that they have an underlying condition, and two, just how it relates to receipt of the vaccine. You should make clear you don't want any other information aside from that, but you are within your rights to ask for documentation that supports that. So now with the religious belief, it's a little bit harder, right? You still are entitled to ask for some type of documentation. It's just that because of the nature of religious beliefs, it tends to, under the law, the recognized forms that you can ask for are, it can be an affirmation or an affidavit from the employee themselves, what their religion is, how long they've held it, those particular beliefs, and again, how they relate to receipt of the vaccine. There might be instances where there's just some misinformation. Perhaps the relation that the employee thinks it has is because they believe the vaccine has some type of animal byproduct in it. That's not true with COVID vaccines. So you want to make sure you're fleshing that out and understand, how the belief actually relates to receiving the vaccine. It could also be an employee, someone else who practices the same faith as the employee, clergy, someone else in their church or their religious sect, who writes an affidavit and basically explains the underlying belief and how it relates to the vaccine. This is a really easy standard to meet, basically because it's hard to dispute. I mean, unless you had a real credibility issue with the employee, it's hard to dispute what their sincerely held religious beliefs are. One thing I do want to note, though, a couple things actually. One, it might not always be what you think would be a religious belief. There are some, I'll call them outlier cases where courts, actually a court for the Third Circuit, which is, what encompasses where we are in Pennsylvania, has held that veganism can be considered a sincerely held religious belief. Basically, the court reasoned this employee believed it as strongly as someone who believes any other tenets of any other religion. And so if, in this instance, if there were animal products in the vaccine, that might be something that exempts an employee from having to receive it. Just watch out for instances like that. It's not to say it's necessarily going to meet the threshold. It's just that those are the things that might, for your general manager or whoever's first receiving that request, they might not always think of it right away as something they think of as a recognized religion. The flip side to that is this is not a protection for strongly held political beliefs or social beliefs, right? The country is very divided right now. It's no secret. And your workforce best. If you have a large contingent that is skeptical of the vaccine or wary of it, or doesn't believe in its efficacy or its safety, you'll know that about your workforce. But it's obviously very divided right now. That being said, someone's political belief or social belief is not protected under the law. And that is not my saying that you don't have to still deal with it as an employer. It's just to say that's not a reason, if you're going to do a mandatory vaccine policy, that they would be exempted from it. So again, if you have someone with a religious belief, you're gonna go through the same process in terms of accommodating them as you would with someone with a disability. So is there a way that they can not get the vaccine but continue to work physically at the location? Again, PPE, isolation, different shifts, whatever it is that feasible? If not, can they telework? Can they take some type of short-term leave that's going to ameliorate the problem? And again, if the answer is no, then and only then can you move to terminate them because they can't comply with the policy and there just simply is no feasible accommodation that you can give them. I just want to make sure we're taking questions as we go.
There was I'm sorry, Allison did put something in the chat. I think she might be jumping off a little early, so she wanted to ask about specific examples of what businesses can do or are doing to incentivize employees.
Yeah, sure. I'm getting to that in 2 slides. So I just want to cover quickly what you can ask in terms of a medical inquiry, and then we're going to talk about incentives, and I'll go through that. So just so you understand, you can ask an employee if they're vaccinated, right? That doesn't get into their medical history. It's just a yes or no. It says actually nothing about their medical conditions or history. It's just a choice they made. It's going that next step and potentially asking why that you have to be careful. So it's considered a protected medical inquiry if it gets into what their underlying health conditions are. If you're going to do that, it's not that you can't ask those questions, but they have to be job related and consistent with business necessity. My advice is to make sure, the thing is, this is probably something, right, especially in an industry like yours, managers just need to be cognizant of it, right? Like if you have a manager that's just chatting with one of your employees, and that employee in the particular group happens to be the only one who hasn't received a vaccine yet. It's okay for the manager to say, have you had your vaccine yet? But when that employee says no, and right, this is intuitive in conversation, this happens a lot. It happened in the beginning when people were saying, oh, you already had a vaccine, how'd you get it so early? You're asking someone something about their medical background, because most likely either their medical background or their age, which are both protected. Most likely that person's going to say, oh, well, you know, I'm actually over 65, or I, you know, have this underlying condition that makes me high risk. You don't want to get into that as an employer. So just make sure, that's just one of those instances I would make sure your management is well trained on. Also, just be cognizant. I've seen a lot of employers doing this, and I think it's fantastic. There's so many creative solutions that are cropping up around this. If you're going to partner with another organization to potentially do vaccines, so you're going to have a day, you've contracted with this healthcare provider, you're going to have a day where you tell your employees, hey, there's a clinic, especially for you, we've contracted with this third-party provider, they're going to do vaccines. Just make sure that you understand any questions that provider asks, if you have a contract with them, are going to be imputed to you as an employer. If you're mandating the vaccine, that might be okay, because those pre-screening questions are going to be consistent and necessary for job and job related, because you've made the decision that if that employee doesn't get a vaccine, they're a direct threat to the rest of your workforce. So the pre-screening questions that go along with it will be protected. Similarly, if you're just going to make the vaccine voluntary, it's also okay, because employees have the option not to answer the pre-screening questions. They're not mandatory. Just be cognizant. Basically, you want to make sure you have control, and you want to understand, if you are contracting with a third party, exactly what they're asking, because I think there's sort of a misperception sometimes that you've put in a shield and you don't have liability anymore, because it's a third party doing it. But if you have a contractual relationship with them, there you can still be liable for things that are asked or done. Okay, so let's move on. Let's get into incentives. Can you incentivize vaccines? I'm going to give you the legal answer, and then I'm going to give you my strong recommendation. The legal answer, and forgive me for being a typical lawyer here and saying it depends, but the EEOC basically came out initially and said, you can't incentivize them. All you can do are give small trinkets. You can give a water bottle, you can give a keychain, you can give whatever. But you can't actually give anything of significance. You can't actually, I mean, we're talking small, right? Like a Starbucks gift card for a coffee. But you can't do anything above that, because it gets you into the realm of a wellness program. And then there are all these parameters you have to meet. You have to stay within a certain threshold of potential health coverage that you're offering. And employers, it makes it far more complicated, and employers sort of stopped in their tracks and said, you know, I had no idea all these all these other potential implications and considerations had to go into it, because now I have to think of it as the same as I would a wellness program. And then the EEOC rolled it all back and said, all that guidance is frozen. You know, that's not our advice anymore. A lot of different businesses from different industries have written and urged the EEOC to come out with some guidance on this issue, just to give peace of mind that employers can properly do this, and the EEOC hasn't. Here's my best prediction. This administration, so there's no law that says you can't. There's just no law that says you can right now. This administration, though, has really made it very obviously, very blatantly, its goal to get Americans vaccinated. And I'll get into it in a little bit. They've even offered tax credits so that you can give your employees the time to go get the vaccine. I would be shocked if we saw any guidance that's saying employers can't incentivize getting it, given the administration's position on it, the CDC's position on it. The CDC is openly and publicly asking employers to encourage their employees to get the vaccine. So especially right now where there's nothing saying that you can't do it, I would say it's fine. There are just a couple considerations that you want to make sure you're factoring in when you consider what you want to do as an incentive. So I'm sure you all have read, it's actually, I think it started really with restaurants and then a lot of grocery store chains too. We're doing gift cards or additional time off. You know, feel free to put in the chat if you had specific questions about, you know, I'm considering doing this incentive, but, you know, am I allowed to do it? There's no, I can't think of anything that would outright be prohibited. The only thing you have to consider, and we can go to the next slide on this, is that let's say you're going to do a couple things actually. Let's say you're going to do a gift card and you're going to do $250 a gift card for any employee who says they've gotten vaccinated, right? But now you have Jane, and Jane can't get vaccinated because of an underlying medical condition. So now all of a sudden Jane can't take advantage of an employment perk or benefit because of her medical condition. And that's where sort of the issue can crop up and you could have potential liability. The way to sort of make sure that you're protected there, continue to offer your incentives, just have an alternate way for those employees who have some exemption for the vaccine to take advantage of the incentive. So my suggestion is to also relate it to some type of health and safety concern. Whether it be something that goes along with PPE or, you know, protecting the workforce generally from transmission, whatever it is, you know, maybe you have that person get periodically tested. And if they get more frequently tested for COVID, you give them the gift card too. Just make sure there's an alternate way that everyone in your workforce can take advantage of the incentive.
Katharine, I have a question about that. It was something someone brought up to me. Is there a threshold of how much you should give, or like before it's like you should only give up to $50 before you get into an area where it's not
so not now. I would imagine that question probably came because when the EEOC guidance first came out, there were thresholds. Like I said, they were basically saying a trinket, something de minimis, a $5 coffee, whatever it is. Now that the EEOC has rolled back that advice, there's no threshold. You know, the one thing I would say, despite my strong prediction about what the administration is going to do with this, you want to stay on top. If you do have an incentive program, make sure you have either trusted outside counsel or you're staying on top somehow of changes in the law, because they're coming fast in this area. And I would be surprised if the EEOC doesn't give some guidance eventually, especially because they're really getting pressure from industry groups to do it. But no, there's no threshold right now. You can do whatever you see fit, and you can get as creative as you want. The other thing I wanted to mention in this area, especially for the restaurant industry, we've seen a lot. I know I saw Krispy Kreme was offering free donuts to customers who showed proof of vaccine. Incentives and essentially for customers. While the focus of this presentation is obviously on your workforce, I just wanted to touch on it. It is a different area of law, but generally speaking, you certainly can, there's no prohibition on all those programs that you see. You can certainly offer, you know, extra drinks at happy hour or extra side of fries or whatever it is for customers, again, legally speaking, who have received the vaccine and show you proof of vaccine. Similarly, I wouldn't get into any, you don't want any other information from that customer aside from the fact that they got vaccinated, but it's no problem to ask them, right? Everyone gets those cards now that show the vaccine. It's no problem to ask them for that if they've been vaccinated, to give them whatever deal or promotion that you're doing, and that's, legally speaking, that's fine. That gets us into reviewing proof of vaccines. Same thing with your employees. There's no problem in asking them to show proof of vaccine. Just make sure that when you're asking for it, you're not getting into any other areas of potential protection. It's ADA, so it's medical conditions, and it's also potential genetic information. There's a separate law called GINA that protects the employee's privacy with respect to genetic information. Usually that means some type of genetic information that shows a predisposition for some medical ailment or disease. Again, just make sure that you don't ask them. You don't want to know anything more than whether or not they've been vaccinated. I also had a question, Hope, I just want to address that you and I were talking about before with respect to, really it's more of an outward facing campaign. If you wanted to have your employees who are vaccinated somehow promote that fact, legally speaking, that's not a problem. So if you have employees, say you get a bunch of buttons or you get a bunch of stickers and employees come in and they say, hey, I got the vaccine. You know, I think this will help with customer relations. Can I wear the sticker? Can I wear the button that says I've been vaccinated? That's fine. The only area you might get into, and just be cognizant of it, doesn't mean you can't do it, just be aware of it. If you start to have a real discrepancy, and this is going to be so dependent on your workforce too. Do you have a lot of employees who are requesting some type of exemption or can't get the vaccine for some type of medical condition? If you're seeing a big discrepancy, like those employees who have gotten the vaccine and wearing the promotion are getting much better tips, you're starting to give them, be careful giving them better tips or what have you, customers like it, it's well received. Just make sure there's not some type of disparate impact on the employees who are not getting the vaccine because they don't want to, but the employees who can't get the vaccine for some protected reason. I would imagine that is that's just something to be aware of. It's probably not going to be an obstacle for you. Otherwise, legally speaking, it's an okay thing to do. We could go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier, sick leave is always a maze. It's always a pain to deal with because especially in the Philadelphia area, Pittsburgh area, Harrisburg, wherever you have a larger city, there tends to be more local ordinances too that you have to deal with. So make sure that when you're considering sick leave, you just know the jurisdiction that you're in, right? So for example, right now, Philadelphia has mandated sick leave, right? So if you're within the city proper, you have to give your employees sick leave to go get the vaccine, or for any potential, say they have an adverse reaction to it for a day or two. That's also an area where they get mandated sick leave. And that's true of New York, that's true of New Jersey, that's true of Maryland. Different laws popping up all over the country. You just want to make sure you know what you're dealing with in the jurisdiction, where you're operating, where you have employees. I mentioned before, so for employers with less than 500 employees, Last year, the federal government enacted the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That gave sick leave, at the time it was mandated, that gave sick leave for COVID-related reasons. In Biden's newest stimulus package, called the American Rescue Plan Act, those reasons for providing sick leave are still there, and they've been added to. They're not mandatory anymore, though, meaning you don't have to give sick leave on the federal level for those reasons. But the perk is, if you are an employer under 500, you will get reimbursed fully 100% through tax credits for giving sick leave, both for the COVID-related reasons, right? If you're diagnosed with COVID, if you're experiencing symptoms, if you're caring for a family member that has the same, as well as now the expanded reasons are if the employee is going to actually receive the vaccine or is recovering from any adverse effects of the vaccine. So, I mean, my recommendation, certainly if you're in an area that mandates it anyway, this is a way, provided you're under 500 employees, to get fully reimbursed for it. So if you're offering the leave under the expanded FCRA, then you're basically going to apply for the reimbursement as a tax credit when you're doing your quarterly tax calculations as an employer. So make sure you stay abreast of. I think we've seen the surge in legislation there, but make sure that the White House is specifically, this came out when the act first came out about a month ago, but the White House is now really advocating and sort of promoting the fact that you can get tax credits for providing sick leave for people to go get their vaccine. Also, just make sure that you consider the employee's PTO bank, your internal policies. If you're using a sick leave policy that you've had, or maybe you updated during COVID, make sure that you, I would say generally speaking, and under the law, a vaccine, especially COVID-19 vaccine, is going to fall under preventative care. So if you have that in your internal policy anyways, that's going to trigger the reason where the person's going to be able to get PTO for it. And again, you could also offer additional leave or like additional vacation day or what have you as an incentive to get the vaccine. And for the same reasons we already discussed, that would be okay. I wanted to touch on, I want to make sure I leave you guys time for questions, but I did want to touch on potential wage and hour issues. So for your non-exempt employees, and in the restaurant world, you're going to have a lot of those. So those are your people who are getting paid hourly and overtime. If you're mandating that the employees get the vaccine, think of it the same way you would as mandating a meeting outside of their normal shift. That person has to be paid their regular rate for the time they spent getting the shot. Even if they got it on, say, a Monday morning when they weren't scheduled to work. So if you're mandating it, you have to pay for the time they spent getting it the same way as if they were in a mandatory training or anything else. I just wanted to note for your tipped employees, they're still going to get paid for that time regular rate, and just make sure you're properly calculating what regular rate is. Oftentimes, depending on whether or not you're taking a tip credit, that's going to be just minimum hourly wage. That might be you take the full tip credit and that person gets, they take, they record and take credit for the tips that get them up to hourly wage, and that's what you're going to consider regular rate, but that might fluctuate. So just know that that's the standard for what you need to be paying them. Cash bonuses, I realize this bullet is a little bit misleading and I want to clear it up. If you're, typically speaking, if you give a cash bonus to an employee, so let's say you're doing some type of program where you're, whoever can achieve the highest sales, alcohol sales in a week gets some type of cash bonus. In an instance like that, the cash bonus has to be recalculated back into that person's regular rate for the week. If we're talking about an incentive for getting a vaccine, that's really going to be viewed just as a gift. So if you give them, say, $100 gift card in the week where they're telling you they got fully vaccinated, that does not have to be calculated back into regular rates. So just be aware of those little nuanced issues when it's coming to pay calculation. And then with respect to the actual cost of the vaccine, right now it's probably not going to be an issue. The federal government has subsidized it, and so it's likely free of charge. Also, if you have any type of employer-sponsored group health plan, it's required under law that that group health plan, as part of preventative medicine, cover the full cost of the vaccine. So likely there's not going to be any out-of-pocket costs for your employees. And again, this is only if you're mandating the vaccine. But check state law. If an employee tells you for some reason that they had to pay something, just make sure you check in the state you're in. Not true in Pennsylvania. So if you guys just have operations in Pennsylvania, you're good. In states like California, there's a requirement to pay certain business expenses for employees. And so in that instance, you might have to cover whatever the cost of vaccine was. Also, in terms of transportation costs, any type of mileage or reimbursement, again, not going to be applicable. You don't need to do it in Pennsylvania. There are some states, again, California, if anyone has operations in California, you know how onerous those laws are, where there's a possibility where you could have to pay for it. But if you're in this area, generally speaking, you don't have to worry about giving mileage or reimbursement for that for the employee's time, or I should say for the employee's cost of going to get the vaccine. I just want to quickly touch on workers' compensation issues. Really, I just want to address this to the extent you might hear about it and it might, cause concern. What do I have to worry about with workers' comp? Really very little. There is the possibility that if you mandate the vaccine and an employee has some type of serious, right, it would have to be a serious adverse reaction enough for them to submit a claim to workers' comp. There's the potential argument that they could say, this adverse reaction or whatever it was, this ailment arose from employment because I was mandated to get the vaccine. I mean, be aware of it, but again, the few instances where that could potentially come up and the employee would be successful are so few and far between. I wouldn't let it dissuade you. I wouldn't let that be the thing that dissuades you from otherwise implementing a mandatory vaccine policy. And again, if you're merely incentivizing it or encouraging it, I would say the argument is almost surely going to fail for an employee to say that somehow a reaction to the vaccine arose from employment, right? If it's voluntary or merely incentivized, it was still well within their volition to get it. And I don't really think there's any traction there. I just wanted to touch on it to the extent you hear it and think, oh, what do I have to be worried about there? So that covers kind of all of the big topics. Like I said, I just wanted to wrap up and sort of give some ideas for other things that I've heard employees doing. One thing I do want to note, it doesn't matter if you're unionized or not. The National Labor Relations Act applies to you as an employer. Whatever you do with vaccines, your employees have the right to talk about it amongst one another. It may be a huge source of frustration, and I get it, especially with the way employees and very much in the restaurant industry are taking to social media lately. If you decide we want to do a mandated vaccine policy, that's what we want to do. We think that's best for the safety of our employees and our customers. And some employee decides they hate it. You can't prevent them from going onto social media and talking about it. Now, once it crosses the line of potentially getting to defamatory statements or unprofessional conduct or discriminating or bullying other employees, well, okay, there are boundaries to that, right? But employees, especially talking amongst themselves, if you have a few employees who have banded together and decided they really hate the policy and they're talking about it, unfortunately, you have to allow them that discourse. Like I said, that doesn't mean, this is another place you probably, if it starts to get really out of hand, you want to consult outside counsel or whoever you use for advice in this area to see where the boundaries are, because obviously there's going to be a point where you want to step in. But just know again, this is an area of training for your management. You can't say, hey, you can't talk about that. You're defaming the company or disparaging the company. You can't talk about the vaccine policy. They're allowed to discuss the vaccine policy because it's a condition of working. So that being said, my best advice is to make sure whatever you do, you're offering either resources to your employees or a way that you're listening to them, whether that be a town hall or you're giving them some type of, whether it's just you're giving them emails with this latest information from the CDC. The best that you can do to inform them in a clear way, because there is so much misinformation about the vaccine, about the efficacy, about the safety. I want to make sure all of you know, because I have so many employers who are dealing with this as clients, what I've done is partnered with Dr. John Porter, who is a physician at Cooper Hospital. He and I are doing a town hall on April 29th at 12 p.m. The goal of it really is for employers to disperse that to their employees and allow their employees a way to log on, have direct access to a physician who specializes. He does a lot of community outreach in this area. And he is open to answering any and all questions related to the vaccine. He'll tell you himself he was skeptical at first and then ultimately decided to get it. And he's there to answer questions as to why and about, any misinformation or rumors that people may have heard. So if you think that might be beneficial to your workforce, I'm happy to provide that information afterward. And then, consider your workforce, the nuances and the uniqueness of them, what you think is going to work best. And then finally, make sure you have a clear and written policy, whatever you decide to do. You want to make sure those communications are black and white and your employees fully understand, what's expected of them. I don't know if there are other questions now, I'm happy to take them.
If you can unmute your line if you'd like to ask the question, not through the chat. This was a great presentation. Thank you so much for laying everything out so clearly. There's obviously this is new for everybody. So this is something different and there's a lot of different nuances and things that everybody should be thinking about. We do have Katharine's contact information here, and we are recording this and we'll send this out. Katharine, are you open if someone has a question to them giving you a quick question, obviously not legal advice, but if they have a question to reach out to you?
Sure, feel free to reach out.
And if you could provide us with that information about the town hall, I think that'd be great to share with our members, because I think it'd be a good option for the employees to feel like they have a place to go that they're not asking their employer. So they're asking, someone outside of their business.
Exactly. And that's the goal. So I'm happy to provide that link. And we sort of did it in a way that employers can disperse it, but employees should know that the employer themselves has no affiliation with it, right? It's a free space to ask what you need to ask.
Sure. No, that'd be great. That I think that's a great idea that you're doing that. The more information people have, the better informed they are to make decisions what they need to do.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you, Caitlin, for helping to coordinate all of this too, and everybody for getting on. This is really great information, and we'll definitely be sharing it out to everyone. And I hope everybody has a great Thursday and Friday and weekend.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.